Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Living 1.5, Empowering People to Live Better and Lighter. I'm Stephanie Vidorini and I work with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, ggkp, your host of today's webinar. In particular, I lead the development of the Green Forum, an online community space for sharing insights and creating solutions that will formally launch in 2021. We are very happy to have you with us today and hope that you are all healthy and safe. This is the final session in 7-part webinar series organized by the United Nations Environment Programme on sustainable living. The series brought together thought leaders almost 1 year into COVID-19 to reflect on how to harness this window of opportunity to drive change for healthier, more sustainable living. Previous sessions have focused on real-world sustainability issues, like why people don't always do the right thing when it comes to sustainability. If you are not already familiar with ggkp, I encourage you to also visit our web platforms and join the growing community at ggkp.org/subscribe. For today's webinar, we are fortunate to be joined by experts from the European Commission, SEED, which are an organization that promotes entrepreneurship for sustainable development, and youth activists or green entrepreneurs that are making change happen on the ground. We welcome comments and questions through the question box. And I would encourage you all to actively submit this and introduce yourself, as it's a fantastic opportunity to engage directly with a panel of experts. And after the webinar, we'd also appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey. It is a feedback like yours that help us shape with future webinars. Please note that a full recording of the webinar will be available at our website at ggkp.org/sustainable_living. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Global Opportunities for Sustainable Development Goals, or Go4SDGs initiative, which was launched by the UN Environment Programme and partners in 2019. Go4SDGs will share innovative practices for greener economies and sustainable production and consumption that can be taken to scale. Importantly, Go4SDGs also offers access to a range of tools and services offered by Go4SDGs partners through a menu of services, many of which are geared towards sustainable lifestyle, including the Anatomy of Action, which aims to help activate sustainable living by providing actions people can take in the domains of food, mobility, leisure, and housing. The Little Book of Green Nudges, which is a guide to sustainable lifestyle changes on campus, shared through universities, student unions, green offices at academic institutions. And the SEED Awards for Entrepreneurship in Sustainable Development, an annual award scheme designed to identify the most innovative and promising locally led startup eco-inclusive enterprises in developing and emerging economies. So, coming back to today's webinar, and without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Solitaire Thompson, a British businesswoman focused on the application of marketing principles to the cause of sustainability and climate change solutions, and co-founder of change agency Futerra. Solitaire, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And after that very warm welcome from Stephanie, I am so excited to be here today. And this is the second of these webinars that I have helped to host over the last few months. And I have to say, I think it's lovely to welcome you all into my home. And I'm sure that I am being welcomed into many of your homes right now, because we're holding this webinar in this extraordinary moment in time. This moment in time where across the world, every human being is facing this terrifying, shocking, difficult moment of a pandemic. And we're responding to it. We're responding to it in ways expected and unexpected. One of the things I wasn't expecting to happen during a global pandemic is for searches on Google Google searches for how to live a sustainable lifestyle to increase by 4,550%. So Google's one of my clients, and they shared this with me recently. And searches for composting, for cooking, for food waste, for fixing clothes, all also going, slow shopping, small shopping, all going absolutely upwards all around the world. Now, part of that, of course, is driven by the fact that sustainable lifestyle is often more financially sensible lifestyle. It's a way to save money, to do more with less. And for all of those who are facing so many economic challenges during this period of time, a sustainable lifestyle is a more financially viable one. Also, from the surveys that I've done myself and what the surveys that Futerra has done, both ourselves and with our partners, we're discovering that many people at the moment are more aware of their lifestyle than perhaps they are otherwise. Those who are lucky enough to have the opportunity to work from home are becoming very aware of what they eat, of how their home is organized, about how much stuff they purchase, becoming with more time, with less busyness, with less travel. Some people, particularly over consumers in different parts of the world, are having that opportunity. And under consumers around the world are also facing great challenges in this moment of time. And there's a really interesting terminology change, which we're seeing in many different languages. And in English, that terminology change is around the word essential. So who is truly essential in our societies? Is it our hedge fund managers who are truly essential, or is it our farm workers who are truly essential? And we're seeing real changes of perception of the role of work and what is counted as valuable work, high status work, and necessary work. And whilst all of this is going on, we're finding a change in the narrative around the world. Now, I first started working in sustainability more than 2 decades ago. And when I first started working in sustainability, I did focus groups with consumers and I talked about biodiversity. And someone asked me if that was a type of washing powder, like biological washing powder. The change in the understanding around the world of what some of these terms mean, particularly in places in the world where sustainability is taught as part of education, formal curricular education. This is beginning to shift a narrative. The youth climate campaigners, the sustainability entrepreneurs, those who are out on the streets asking for change. This has changed the global narrative around sustainability. We begin to see people such as the CEO of Rethink, the CEO of BlackRock, not anyone's definition of a traditional environmentalist, calling on businesses to change their purpose towards sustainability. And yet still here we are in a level where, despite all of this, despite the pandemic, despite the change in the narrative that's beginning to happen in some places in the world, despite the focus upon essential work, we are still seeing those carbon numbers creep up. We're still seeing overconsumption, we're still seeing undereducation, we're still seeing huge parts of our economy and our lives being run in unsustainable ways. So how do we change that? Now, there's often, in conversations like this, often a big debate rages about whether we should be focusing on powerful people, on the governments and the businesses who create the architecture that we all operate in. Should we be focusing on ministers and CEOs and leaders because they have the primary responsibility? Government leaders are primarily responsible for fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. So those powerful people, or should we be focusing on people power? On the billions of us around the world how we eat, how we travel, what we buy, how we vote, what we teach our children. Should we take the responsibility, and through our lifestyles can we make the change? And there debate rages about which side of this is the silver bullet, which is going to create a sustainable future. My view is we need both. that it is very, very difficult for government to make some of those sweeping changes without at least some engagement from their citizenship. And we see that even now with mask wearing. You can bring in laws, you can create incentives, but if the population, if the public don't comply with that, then you're still in the problem. And mask wearing is perhaps a great example of the challenges we have with changing sustainable behaviours. On the other side, you can be a consumer who is attempting to live the most sustainable lifestyle you can. Perhaps you're living in a country like Sweden or elsewhere, where there's already a lot of infrastructure around you to enable you to do that. Yet at the same time, your behaviours are curtailed by what your government allows you to do. In many countries in the world where my company operates, we help to encourage recycling behaviours. In some of the other countries where my company operates, we have to focus on creating those recycling infrastructure in the first place. There's no point us trying to tell people to recycle if there aren't any recycling bins available. So you have to have the recycling bins, and you need to have people use them. So both of these aspects must work together. What we're going to focus on here today is the how do we do it? What actually works? And so we've got some fantastic speakers who I'm so pleased who are joining us. We have Louise from Seed, we have Louise from the Cacao Project, we have Sebastián from Rutopia, and we have Hugo representing the EC. And between us, we're going to have a debate about what works. But I need you as well. First of all, right now, and I see some people are already beginning to do it. Thank you, those who have done so. Right now, please go into the chat function to all and introduce yourself. Let us know who's here. You can introduce your organisation, you can say a word or two about your projects, or you can just say hi. But it'd be really great to see who we have joining us online today. I also need you to ask questions, and the questions is a different part of the technology to the chat. So after you've introduced yourself, please ask questions, clarification questions, questions that push this debate, questions that get the best answer from our panelists as we discuss the issues of sustainable lifestyle. And perhaps we all of us who are speaking will reflect as well on our lifestyle, because not all of us are powerful people, but all of us have people power. Now, one of the people who I've known for many years who has a lot of people power and is also a powerful person is Louise from Seed. Louise is one of the biggest thinkers. He has statistics and the psychology and the research at his fingertips around how this change happens. And one of the things which I've been most impressed with from Louise over the years is an absolute clarity on what works and what doesn't. So Louise, if you're able to join, please bring your camera up and your sound on. And Louise, I'd love to ask you about the myths and realities. Like, what all of us have these assumptions, these knee-jerk, these beliefs about what's going to create change. Be we a business, be we a policymaker, be we a campaigner, be a community organizer, we all have these beliefs about what is it that's going to really create change. But I know that some of those beliefs we carry around with us might not be true. So tell me about the myths and tell me about the realities of what it's going to take to live in a 1.5 degree lifestyle.
Thank you so much, Solly, and for the wonderful introduction, the very flattering one. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today. It's a wonderful day in a terrible period. And Solly has just explained a lot about the COVID-19 and the partial or different extents of lockdown that we're all experiencing. And it is worth, since we're talking about sustainable lifestyles and we're projecting into lifestyles of the future and also looking at youth, to think a little bit about what we've learned from this COVID-19 situation. What we know from actual measurement is that at the very peak of the lockdown, we saw reductions in carbon emissions of about 17% globally. In China, this was about 25%. This was largely because of people not traveling, not flying around, and staying home. But what is estimated is that by the end of this year, we will have a total reduction in emissions of about 7% globally. This is the biggest average annual reduction we've seen in carbon emissions since World War II. And it is also, it just happens to coincide with what the IPCC says we need to reduce every year in terms of our emissions if we have to meet the target of 1.5 degrees that was set, or that is aspirational to the Paris Agreement. But all this pain, all this staying at home and not seeing loved ones, all this not going to the park, all this not meeting each other for drinks and hugging and kissing and celebrating Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever it is, just for a 7% reduction in emissions. And this is where the difference comes between a planned transition to sustainable living and a chaotic transition to sustainable living. You can think of this as an early warning sign that if we do not plan and carefully transition to sustainable lifestyles, we are going to be faced with worse than the chaos we have now. What have we seen during this period? We've seen the fragility of our public healthcare systems. We've seen questions of trust in public institutions and experts in science, in some governments. We've seen an exposure of inequalities and fragility of social systems, where in some cases there are particular groups that are being affected more than others, and they do not even have the economic support systems to go through it. We've really seen how central work is to our everyday living or to our participation in community, and we've seen how strong or weak our community systems are. What does this say? We published 2 years ago, I worked with a number of colleagues to publish what is now the 1.5 degree lifestyles. And what it looked at is the gap between where we are now and where we need to be if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. And what it pretty much looks at is our carbon budget, what we have left, right? If you take your average carbon footprint and then you subtract government expenditure, you also subtract capital formation or investments, and you add the cost or the carbon cost of production in China or wherever your products are that you consume, then you get your lifestyle carbon footprint. So it comes as close as possible to the impact you actually have as you can get. And for this, it was estimated that we need to go down from 4.5 to 2.5 to 1.4 to 0.7 tons per person. We need to be at 0.7 tons by 2050 per person per year. We're now at about 4.5, and some countries like Finland are at 10.4. What it is saying is pretty much every industrialized country needs to reduce its lifestyle carbon footprint by more than 70% before 2030, and in most cases by about 90% before 2050. Think of that for a moment. The lifestyle or the consumption level you have now needs to shrink to about 10% of it if you're in industrializing countries, in an industrialized country. But if you're also in China or India, already, although you do not necessarily need to reduce by 2030, where you need to be by 2050 is already surpassed. And you know you have neighbors and friends who cannot even meet their basic needs. If you're like my grandma, you're partly in that situation, right? So how do we deal with this? The problem is there's so many misleading approaches we've taken to this that have helped us to evade the question. Is it the individual or is it the system that has to change? This is pretty much a false dichotomy. It isn't something which Solitaire has put very carefully. Is it the powerful people or the people with power? I like the eloquence of that, Soli, and I'm going to borrow it from you. But quite often we've thought it is just an issue of awareness raising, that if we tell people, oh, this is green, or the climate is bad, and so on, and we're in an emergency, and then they will change. We forget to understand that eco labels are not enough, and that people do not just go out to consume because they want to poison the environment, but because there are lots of things. They want to be friends with people. They want to be part of society. They want to live their lives. And if we do not have the right infrastructure to support this, if we do not have the right policies that support this, it will be very difficult. And last but not least, one of the big myths here is that it's just a developing country issue, that reductions need to happen. It is also very much it's both a developed and a developing country issue. We're seeing middle class in some developing countries that live much more exuberantly than you would find in industrialized countries. And we're seeing in industrialized countries large pockets of poverty that are beginning to explode, and which, in fact, this pandemic has helped to expose even more. So where do we go from here? three key things I would like to propose, especially since we're talking about youth and the future. And we happen to have someone from the EC here. This is also hosted by UNEP and the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. I would start with top down and bottom up. The first thing is we do not have a global framework that targets consumption and lifestyles. We absolutely do not have it. We have pockets of it built into the 10-year framework of programs. And the time the 10-year framework of programs was designed, we didn't yet have the SDGs, and the macroeconomic knowledge of what works and what doesn't work has changed substantially since then. And we know that it's up for review in 2 years. This is really a good opportunity to see how we reframe that. Fortunately, we also have the Go for SDGs platform, which is funded by Germany, and SEED is proud to be a partner of this. We also have UNEP on board, and it is showcasing lots of examples. But the question is, how do we package all of this into a global platform that supports youth, looks at lifestyles, and begins to address things like infrastructure, enabling systems and infrastructure, access and equity to provisioning systems for the key domains of food, mobility, housing, and helping us to rethink what the role of work is and how employment or labor of the future will look like. We need this. The second thing we need is to start rethinking the role of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Quite often, we look at this in the same breath as large multinational organizations. But it is not true, because it is a missed opportunity to actually see the grassroots innovation that happens here. SEED has looked very extensively at different micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And in fact, some of those that we've worked with, more than 60% of them are founded by women. More than 60% of them have equity in terms of payment between men and women. They solve health problems, local waste problems, and they go to lots of extent to employ marginalized people and to look at things which are not necessarily always looked at when we see just from the broad framework. How do we come up with the access to finance for this micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises? How do we make sure they're a part of the government framework that is not only looked as the economic side of it, but also providing to support lifestyles that are meaningful at a local level? And how do we make sure that they have the skills to continue to contribute towards frameworks like the SDGs? These are things that we must be asking ourselves as we go forward. The last but not the least is the need to rethink cities, because cities are thriving hubs of where we have the largest populations. But somehow we've thought of it as just technology, roads, and houses, and occasionally the cinema and a few other things, right? But cities also have zoning laws that force us to travel in one form or another to various places. And this travel has impact. Cities have zoning that have areas just for working and areas just for living that force us to adopt to different habits that are necessarily less meaningful and less fulfilling. How do we rethink zoning of cities in ways that are more joyful, to bring in place more public spaces and to make sure that city living is a little bit more exuberant than it currently is? The next thing is looking at an urban well-being index for cities. How do we come up with an index that guides government investments or municipality investments to make sure that current day infrastructure that they're putting money into or systems that they're putting money to would not only be sustainable, but it helps guide towards better well-being for its citizens in the future? And how do we, within this architecture of cities, make sure that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are actually playing a role, not just as economic actors, but also social actors that are connecting needs and people and communities to different opportunities than necessarily found within the multilateral, within transnational corporations. I will leave it at that, but I think I can elaborate a little bit more and give a few more examples from SEED as we go down the road.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you. And thank you for setting us up by setting it out an actual plan for how we begin to make those changes. Really appreciate it. I'm seeing lots of people introduce themselves in the chat. Thank you so much for that. It's brilliant to see what an international group we have joining us. I'm also seeing a few questions coming in on the chat. If you've asked a question on the chat, could you please transfer that into a question in the questions function? Otherwise, we lose the questions in the chat and I might not get to them. So please transfer your question to the question function. I'd really love to see those. Now, one of the things that Louise mentioned was the need to really focus on, to uplift and to enable small and medium-sized enterprises, and particularly founders and entrepreneurs who are female. And I think, Louise, if you wouldn't mind joining us, please, and coming online and unmuting. Louise is a perfect example of this. So hello, Louise, thank you for joining us. Now, Louise, I've taken a look at you, and you're a role model. You're a role model for women like me. You're a role model for young women who are coming into this section. How did you come to be a food systems entrepreneur? And please do say a little bit more about the Cacao Project. But how did you come into this? How did you come to understand that you could create a business model around it? Because many of the people who are watching and seeing what you've managed to achieve might not really understand what they need to do to take the journey to get there, because you really are changing lifestyles. Over to you, Louise.
Well, thank you so much for that question, Solly. Now, I'd love to give a little bit of background and exposition and tell you kind of the abbreviated version of the journey that led me here into kind of becoming an entrepreneur in food systems. And it started early on in my career as a chef. At the age of 12 years old, I was a junior master chef finalist on the famous TV reality show that Gordon Ramsay started. And I was one of the Philippine finalists. And after that show, it came with a lot of glamour and prestige. And, you know, with that coming with it, I spent a lot of my formative years, my teenage years, training under the top chefs in the world. So I was catapulted into this male-dominated industry out of nowhere. And even as a young girl, I don't know how I managed to pull it off, but somehow I did by giving it my best shot. So right now I'm 22 years old, and I've been in the culinary industry for 10 years. And in that time frame, I got exposed to the world food systems. I saw how there was a very big problem with our food industry. Slowly, as I was a chef, as I was working with hotels and restaurants, I saw how suppliers would drop off from our radar, and there were ingredients that slowly became harder and harder to come by. And there was this, more importantly, there was this massive disparity between consumers and producers, where people didn't understand where their food was coming from and how it got to their plates. So in response, I started an advocacy in creating farm-to-table food that was locally sourced. I created sustainable menus. And it was when I started growing my own ingredients too that this whole other world was revealed to me. And I thought, like, I started agriculture at the age of 14. And I thought, wow, there is a whole system of gears and parts that make it such a miracle for our food to make it onto our tables anymore, because it goes through such a long process and people aren't aware of that. But for me, a defining point in time was after I was growing my own ingredients, my town was hit by Super Typhoon Nok-10. And this typhoon destroyed over 80% of agricultural livelihoods in my hometown. And this put our food systems in jeopardy. We were suffering food insecurity. And beyond that, agriculture in my town employs a large part of the population, not just in my town, but in my country. And these were people that were vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It caused this ripple effect of issues that put their livelihoods at stake, that really affected our food systems and our entire economy. So I knew that I had to do something. And that something was my agricultural venture called the Cacao Project. So we trained and equipped farmers for sustainable success, and we reevaluated this model of food systems in our community and worked to establish better resiliency to cultivate economic forests that would benefit both the people in my town and the planet. So that by reaping good harvest, we were also trying to work better for nature. We realized that we needed to deconstruct existing cultural stigmas surrounding agriculture in our community, and we needed to restore the dignity of this industry, because in the Philippines, farmers are one of the most vulnerable sectors, and they're vulnerable to hazards brought about by climate change. And in fact, in our schools, they teach children that, you know, if you fail in your classes, if you get bad grades, you'll become a farmer. And farming equates to failure and poverty, which is absolutely ridiculous considering that a lot of our food relies on that. So that was something that I set out to change. And my goal was to transform the industry so that we integrate circular economy with less waste, integrate regenerative farming so farmers could save more while creating better outputs, and get farmers to understand their value, not just to the economy. I mean, they're already extremely valuable to the economy, but also their value to the ecosystem so that they can improve their harvests through environmental stewardship. Now, you asked me a second question, and that was, what can young women like me do to make a difference? So I do have a number of to-do lists, but one of them for all of you in the audience is, number one, find your niche. Because there's so many environmental activists, and if there's something that you want to do, I always tell people, you don't have to strive to be the next Greta Thunberg. There's nothing wrong with being the next Greta Thunberg, but I always tell young people, especially like me, that you can be the next up and coming you. And second, find how you can integrate into environmental stewardship and sustainable solutions into the work that you do and the work that you love best, what you're passionate about. That's where you can make meaningful and tangible change. Sorry, just a minute there. But more importantly, I always tell people, this is something that's really important to me and close to my heart, is to start locally. Because I started within my own community because I believe in instilling change at the grassroots level. And no one knows your community and your environment better than the locals, better than you. And especially the people who have lived experiences and understand that ecosystem best, because you are most informed to act for change wherever you are. So start with what's closest to you and chisel your path from there. Inform yourself, grow, and learn. And lastly, I always tell people, you are a steward to our planet. So you're a steward to the creation we live in the work that we do. So take responsibility for it. And that's mainly what I have to say for now, but I know that a lot of people have a lot of really good questions that I can see coming up in the chat. So I'll definitely answer those in our question and answer portion. I really love meaningful discussion with everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Louise, and thank you. That's super inspiring. And what a story and a journey that you've been on. And that issue around status. These are how human beings are programmed. And if we think of human beings as being machines, which you provide information to when they do something, then we're missing the fact that arguably we are the most complex part of this system. And our hearts and our minds and our learnt behaviours and our inherited assumptions are such a part of that. So thank you so much, Louise, for raising that, because if we're going to change to sustainable lifestyles, we're going to have to make sure that those lifestyles, including the lifestyles of a farmer, are high status. Thank you so much, Louise. And Louise, we're going to jump from you, and I'm going to now ask Sebastián to join us from Rutopia in Mexico. Now, Sebastián, being based in Latin America, being based in Mexico, tell us a little bit about your journey that you've been on, and what tactics are you using to inspire young people to change our collective future?
Sure, thank you, Schally. So it's great to be here. I would like to start telling the story of how Rutopia started. So Rutopia is a social enterprise, a social startup, tech startup, focused on creating sustainable solutions for rural people living in villages, many indigenous people living in Mexico. So about 3 years ago, my co-founder and I met Alejandra, which is a very hardworking woman in Oaxaca, a very nice place in Mexico, in the south of Mexico, where she had to cut down trees and sell charcoal to make a living. And many people around were starting to cut down all the forests that they had there to be able to make pulque, which is a traditional drink that we drink here in Mexico. So Alejandra was just one example of many people in Mexico who have to cut down their forests or degrade their ecosystems in order to make a living. And many have to put cattle, many have to cut down their jungles to put palm oil, for example. Many have to do many other things that are degrading the forest that we have right now. And we as travelers, as young travelers, without being entrepreneurs yet, we went to these places and we were realizing all these issues that were arising. Now in Mexico, more than half of all our population lives in these rural villages. And about 90% of all the indigenous population live in protected areas that are being degraded right now. So we thought, well, there is a huge demand of people that are traveling to Mexico, wanting to see these amazing places, not only the nature, but the culture. Actually, 38 million people come to Mexico each year wanting to live this type of travel. And at the same time, we have millions of people degrading their ecosystems in order to make a living. There's a huge mismatch here. So we found this opportunity and we said, well, let's make Rutopia. Now, Alejandra, actually, when we met her, she was making her own ecotouristic project. She started making some cabins for people to be able to stay there. And she was also making an experience, a guided experience to get to know how to drink pulque and walk through the forest and waterfalls. But she had been doing this for 1 year, and in 1 year, she couldn't actually bring people to visit her project. People just didn't know that they existed. And it was such a shame because it's an amazing place. Like, if all of you were to visit this place, you would be amazed at how beautiful it is. But Alejandra and her team couldn't be able to make ecotourism a sustainable way of living for the community there. And just because people didn't know. So that's how Rutopia started. We found that 2/3 of all local ecotouristic projects failed, actually. Many people who started on these projects couldn't reach the critical mass of travelers who wanted to visit them and had to shut down and could not bring people to this type of living. So we found out that digitalization could be the solution for this. Just by bringing them to digital platforms, other travelers could find them easier, and then this could change the whole dynamic. And that's how we started actually 2 years ago in Rutopia, contacting different touristic projects and then bringing them to the digital world so they could start having travelers. So this is like the story of what Rutopia can do. We haven't seen like hard data yet on how Rutopia is stopping deforestation. We have measured, for example, the perception of the value of the ecosystems of the owners of these lands, and it has increased a lot. For example, in the 2 years ago, a community in Chiapas, the south of Mexico, didn't see much value on the forest that they have, even though there were like these amazing quetzales, that these birds and jaguars and everything. They just saw it like a terrain that they could cut down and put cattle in. But now they see it as a touristic attractive, that people that come from outside, maybe from the US, where many people come to Mexico to want to see the rainforest, now they see the value in their forest. So this is like one great sign that we're very excited, because we know that this change in the perception can mean a change in a lot of ecosystems being saved. Now, so Rutopia has 2 years now, and 1 year of those is actually under the pandemia, the global COVID. So travel industry has been one of the worst affected of all. And this did mean a very tough moment for Rutopia and for the local entrepreneurs working in these places. But we did start to see a very important shift in the mindset of people who were traveling. People were starting to travel locally, and they were starting to travel to wide spaces, areas, which meant nature. We start seeing this shift. I'm talking about this in the past because with the second wave of COVID, we saw this come down, but we know that it's going to go up again. So what we're doing right now in Rutopia is we are aligning what we see that travelers want with what we know that the rural villages can offer, with what we know can create a social impact. As a designer and entrepreneur, we're always told you should align what people want with what your business wants. But what if we add one more to that alignment? What people want, what business want, and what's better for the world, or what's better for the local ecosystems. So that's like a reflection I would like to share. Like, how can we align people wants and what the world wants?
Sebastián, I think that is a fantastic question in terms of a way to frame what being an entrepreneur means. Also, thank you so much for bringing in the tool of digitization to this, because so much of the challenges that we have with sustainable lifestyles is people's desire to live and the information, the accessibility, the way to do so. I was very excited to see recently when Google published their new global climate strategy, that within that strategy, Google has committed to enabling 1 billion people to make more sustainable choices in the next 2 years, because exactly the kind of program that you're suggesting there, which is where technology can enable the lifestyle and the sustainable need. It's a fantastic example you have there of how that's possible, and also gives me a lot of hope that when you've got willing participants, it's possible to create that change. Sebastián, please stay with us. We have lots of questions coming in, but I want to go now to Hugo. And Hugo, if you could bring your camera and your video up, thank you. So Hugo, you've heard a lot here from Louise, who began by setting out these 3 areas, from the infrastructure that we need to the role of SMEs and entrepreneurs to the need to think at a city scale, to Louise with her project talking about how do you actually, as an entrepreneur, as a young entrepreneur, how do you drive this change, and also the key of the entrepreneur mindset, which Louise holds in abundance, problem solving, to Sebastián and that fantastic insight that he had in the needs of the local communities to for a sustainable lifestyle in terms of income and quality of life and standard of living, and the need of the visitors who came to Mexico. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, individuals changing their lifestyles. We see across Europe what's happening to meat and dairy consumption. There's a lot going on with young entrepreneurs who are getting in there and beginning to solve some of these challenges. There's a lot going on from large businesses. There's a lot going on in municipalities and in communities, but there's still a lot of barriers. So from an EC perspective, from a policy making perspective, and having heard about these challenges and these emerging voices and change makers, how can policy best serve both to take down some of these barriers and also to really upscale this work on sustainable consumption and production in this COVID-19 era? Hugo, you're on mute.
I made the usual mistake starting to talk to myself. So thank you very much for having me this afternoon, and thank you to my co-panelists for already painting such an exciting picture on looking at what are the prerequisites for moving in that direction, and then to point at some very exciting grassroots and close to the field experiences and examples of what you can do. But I think that already shows the main challenge that we have is how can we scale up the transition from those who boldly go ahead against regulatory and fiscal and financial adversity to actually being trailblazers in that regard, and how can we transfer that to the mainstream, because that's really the key issue. And I think that's something that from a public policy perspective, we need to look at how do we actually promote this, and how can we actually make sure that societies and economies as a whole make that transition. And I think that in the EU, that has been a long-standing ambition. And when you go back, I mean, policy-wise, we're looking at that in 2011 with the resource efficiency roadmap that we created, with the first circular economy action plan in 2015, and now with the second circular economy action plan in 2020. And I think it all comes together in what we have declared the new sustainable growth strategy in the EU, which is the European Green Deal, which is a plan to make the whole economy sustainable. and which has a number of important components, which actually are components that all contain elements that are mainly designed to empower the individual consumer, the citizen, to actually being able to make the choice. Because today, in large parts of the society and economy, even if you're well disposed, the possibility to make the sustainable choice isn't even there. And that's, I go back to what Louise said in the very beginning, just labeling and providing information is not going to be enough. I think you need to go the next step in actually making the whole regulatory and fiscal system supportive to that change. And I think that the main building blocks that we have in the European Green Deal have as an objective to do exactly that. And I think that in that regard, I would want to focus on the Circular Economy Action Plan, because it's so closely related to SDG 12, it's so closely related to sustainable consumption and production, that I think it's worth looking at that. And I think recalling that what the ambition here in that one is, we have a number of interrelated initiatives that should establish a strong and coherent framework that will actually aim at making sustainable products, sustainable services, and sustainable business models the norm, and actually thereby help transform consumption patterns. And I think I insist on that because we may all want to do that, but if those products are not in the shops, if the services are not on the market, and if aspiring businessmen and entrepreneurs do not see that they can make a living and a profit out of it, it will remain in small niches. And I think that's what we need to do. There is also linked to that something that we call the new consumer agenda, which actually is supposed to give more power to the consumer, to give the consumer more rights with regards to products being repaired, products being replaced, spare parts being available. So to actually make it mandatory to offer the sustainable choice. There also is a role for the green public procurement field, where the big spending power of public institutions should also be geared toward making the choice for the best product. The best product in a sense is the most sustainable product, because normally it should last.
Hugo, if you can hear me, we're struggling to connect, and I wanted to hear your last point. I think we may have to ask Hugo to make that last point for us when he rejoins. I really wanted to hear more about the new consumer agenda and how that can help protect the rights of consumers to have the sustainable choice. However, already with the Circular Economy Action Plan, with this need to balance demand and supply of sustainable products, I think Hugo has set out for us quite a strong view from the EC around how change can happen. Can I have everybody back, please? Louise, can you come and join me, please? Louise, Sebastián, can you come and join me here as well, please? Thank you so much. And we'll bring Hugo back in once the 21st century connection issues have solved. Hello, Hugo. Are you back with us?
I'm back, and I apologize. What I said to you in preparing for this has exactly happened. So thank you for bearing with me. So I think when I lost connection, I was talking about the consumer agenda, the role of public procurement, and to make sure that public procurement, the spending power of the public institutions, to be supportive to sustainable business models, because that's another thing. Stop free riding and stop making unsustainable business models being interesting for entrepreneurs. And I think that in that regard, also to say that we then need to go out, and that's what we're planning to do, and to work on specific sectors. And I just mentioned some of them, continuing to focus on plastics, have a huge focus on the textile sector, have a huge focus on construction and buildings, and food and drink, and of course, mobility. So I think all that will be part of a big push for a sustainable product policy framework, which actually means that a lot of regulatory firepower to make sure that what is on the European market is actually responding to aspirations by consumers to be able to give them the sustainable choice. Because I think it works both ways. Yep. If the answer very often by a business is, oh, the consumer doesn't want it because he has never asked for it. But how can they ask for something which is not available? So I think that's something you need to secure the supply, and with the supply, there will be an enhanced demand. And I think that needs to be mainstreamed into the main distribution channels. And we're certainly going to continue to work with distributors, with the big market players, because if they relegate such products and services to the back shelves, then it's not going to work. So I think just in summarizing, several layers of aspects of regulatory action in support of the transition of the market to more sustainable products and services. Transparency is key. Product characteristics and material characteristics is key. And I think that together with also an action on sustainable finance will make sure that there is more choice available. Why do I say finance in the end of my intervention right now? Is like the finance sector needs to be brought in by establishing clear criteria. What is a sustainable, a green investment? Like that, also to bring that on board. And that's what we're doing with the Sustainable Finance Action Plan and its different initiatives. It's a lot, and the Commission will attempt to deliver all the initiatives that we have promised by 2023. And that will be a massive amount of different initiatives designed to be developed in dialogue with stakeholders, civil society and business, so that we can actually make a real impact on the ground and serve the overall objective that we have, basically reduce our carbon footprint, reduce our environmental footprint with regard to biodiversity and forests, and actually be more resource efficient in the same time. So I could go on, as you realized, perhaps very long just describing the different initiatives, but I wanted to give you a general flavor of what we're trying to do in the years to come to support the effort that is being made both by the market and by the consumers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hugo. And really encouraging to see that the time horizon is 2023. I see far too many 2050, 2060 time horizons. So 2023 is sort of on our watch. And I think that's what are we going to do on our watch is whilst those of us who are setting those rules and targets are the same people who are going to have to fulfill them, I think is a very fair way of doing it. So thank you, Hugo. Also very excited to hear what you have to say around increasing that supply of sustainable products and breaking through this. Well, if people ask them, we'd supply them. It always reminds me of what Henry Ford said when he launched the Model T Ford, which is if I'd made what people wanted, it would have been a faster horse. So we need that quote. What's that quote for 2020 with everyone bringing more sustainable products onto the market? So we have a lot of questions and I've got this fantastic panel to answer them. I'm not going to do them in order because looking at the questions, I think there's a little bit of a story emerging. But I want to come back to you. Number one, can you please put a link to the 1.5 lifestyles work that you mentioned into the chat at some point before the end, because lots of people have asked for where to find that. But you mentioned three things, and two of them, the last two, around SMEs and around cities. And I love the language you used about cities, about bringing joy. How can we bring more joy? Because I think when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the, should we say, the technical benefits of sustainability, the lower environmental footprint, the money saving. And we don't talk enough about the emotional benefits of living somewhere that's more joyous. But the question that we've had from Kate is about those two issues of SMEs and cities. So what would your advice be? How can we get those small and medium-sized enterprises more involved in helping to plan these cities that are designed for a sustainable lifestyle? Because at the moment, I think often the SME voice isn't taken into consideration in how cities are planning their recovery, particularly from COVID.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good question. We tend to think of our cities as this flashy places where we live, but they're really just dumps for large-scale infrastructure and technology. And think of so many initiatives that came up in the name of smart cities. All it pretty much wanted to do was to sell technologies to households and municipalities and so on, and leave it at that. But the human element, while I wouldn't say it's missing, it becomes a bit of an afterthought to this background that we've presented of tall buildings and fast-moving cars and fuel and pumping fossil fuel all around. If you were to think of cities in terms of, I would say, thriving cities with, say, public spaces, green provisioning systems, and so on. On the one hand, it's worth thinking about the needs perspective. Who lives in the city, what do they need, and so on. And then on the other hand, thinking about the provisioning system, what brings those needs or wants to those people. And you ask, who intervenes in this provisioning system? How are these provisioning systems designed? Who participates in the procurement processes, and so on? What you quickly start noticing is micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are not really designed to be a part of this. This is partly because procurement processes are so complex that it almost always keeps them out. I don't think it's intentional that they're kept out. It's a design issue that keeps them out. Procedures make it difficult for them. That's the first thing. The second thing is access to finance. Almost always, it needs a certain amount of upfront investment to be able to participate in these provisioning systems, be it for food, for mobility systems, for housing, and compliance with certain standards, and so on. It needs a certain upfront investment. And we do not necessarily have the infrastructure for this to support SMEs with these finances. I was really happy that Hugo joined and actually mentioned finance, because a bit more and more, we're beginning to realize that the infrastructure we have for finance is a 19th century infrastructure. I'm not even going to go as far as saying 20th century. And it completely ignores that the most vibrant elements of society are those grassroots elements that are bringing in innovation, that are picking up ideas that usually get lost and build them into small, thriving businesses, which can then be scaled. But the fact that we do not even have financing mechanisms to cater for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in response to this thriving aspect is really a travesty. So that is one. I'll give a very concrete example from Seed, if you would allow me. There's a company in Uganda. It's called Ecoplasta. It hires women and youth, and what they do is they collect plastic. This again links to the EU's circular economy, one of the topics, plastics. They collect plastics and they convert it into poles, into floor tiles, into different things that for reuse. But this is a story we've all heard. What we've not heard is the agility of a company like this. During the COVID, when the COVID was really at its peak in Uganda, they could, even before major corporations could turn around, they quickly turned around and started looking at production of mass to be able to support waste pickers in this country and in this municipality. What do they provide? They support waste services. They don't only do that, they provide waste medical insurance to collectors from low-income households. They hire about 50 persons, and they've managed to save about 360 metric tons of plastics, while preventing emission of about 2.5 million kilograms of carbon. This, to me, is a microcosm of an enterprise of the future. And yet, if they were to go out and go to a bank to ask for financing, they would not qualify. And yet, waste is something which almost every city is generating in quantities that we can hardly manage. This is the perversion of our system.
And it's a wonderful example as well of a potential solution facing challenges. Now, Louise, we've had a question from Garrett around So you had this extraordinary journey from having been a MasterChef contestant to then having this incredible education to become an entrepreneur. What do you think needs to change worldwide about how we are educating young people? You know, I think it's, as Louise said, you know, we're operating in a 19th century financial system. Perhaps we're even operating in an 18th century education system in some ways, in terms of what people are trained for. What do you think needs to change about how young people are educated so that more young people, perhaps those who weren't either as lucky or talented as you are, more young people have got that opportunity to really be solutionists for sustainability?
Well, it's a really good question now. And as you mentioned, a lot of our school curriculums and education systems are just so outdated. And we have this rapidly changing world that doesn't equip young people to kind of fully understand or immerse in it. So I think worldwide, we really need a shift in curriculums that better immerse young people in our planet outside the four corners of the classroom. Now, for me, my education was, I was homeschooled and I spent a lot of time in Open University. So instead of, studying at home, I would study on farms, I would study in different places, and that helped me have a better understanding of how the world works, a more realistic perspective of how the world works. It wasn't just purely theoretical, but it was very hands-on, that I realized that if I didn't do something, I was going to suffer a terrible future if I didn't act now and encourage more young people to do something similar. And I also realized that I needed to be more proactive in the solutions because problems won't solve themselves. So again, we need have better access as well for young people and improvement in how these curriculums evolve to address this changing world, especially now with climate change and new issues popping up every single day. And we need better inclusivity of education that is tailor-fitted to youth within each region, to the issues we face. For example, in the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of young people are taught that farming equates to failure. But we have a country that employs about 40%, even more of the population in agriculture. And you're telling them that a vast majority of these people are poor, for lack of a better word. And that kind of changes the mindset and perspective of these young people. So instead, I was always saying we need to stop glorifying this certain lifestyle that is unsustainable, that is the ordinary way of life, and we need to bring up better examples of number one, solutions-based kind of mindsets where young people can realize that they are equipped to do something and they are important. And another thing is to actually bring in role models as well that actually are doing something to make a change and to get young people to understand that. And I think Sebastián also mentioned this in the chat, is to kind of tell people that sustainability is not just an added bonus, it's a necessity, because we're all on the same planet. We all need to be part of this journey that is regenerative and restorative and circular. So I think that's one of them, although there's plenty of things that we can do to change school curriculums. I think it's just demanding better education for our young people. And if you are a parent, then making sure that your children are educated in that, as our times are clearly changing and we need to keep up.
I think that's absolutely spot on, and the access to education itself is part of the sustainable lifestyle. And I think your point about role models, having people that can, paths that feel, even if they're difficult, that it is possible to walk down. Thank you so much for that. Sebastián, and I'm afraid I'm coming to you as our resident now technology and digital expert. That's what you've been working on. We've had a question from Monica, I think it is, around big data and around the potential for technology to solve some of the challenges. I would, again, mentioning Google, who's one of my clients. I worked with Google on their circularity strategy, where we identified that waste is actually a data problem. It's not a behavioural problem, it's not even a financial problem. It's primarily a data problem of knowing where waste is within a system. And that sort of mindset change of seeing it as an information problem has really helped Google drive the work that they're doing in circularity. What else can big data do for us? How else can technology, how do you see that emerging over the next 2 years as ways to really enable sustainable lifestyles?
Yeah, well, I'm a very data enthusiast. I'm a designer actually, but an advantage that data and technology have on businesses is that it has a potential to be exponential. So this means that you can build one piece of software and then that can transform, that same thing that you did can transform the lives of thousands or millions of people. Now, having this potential, you can solve so many issues related to this, from a simple optimization of a process that can optimize something 50%, 20%, to something that changes 1000% in improvement. So this, so at Rutopia, for example, we see the B2C part, business to consumer, where we connect consumers to people in these areas. Now, at the same time, we are generating a lot of data regarding the economic activities of the rural villages with which we work. Now, this information, we believe, should not be only in the hands of Rutopia or in tech startups, but it should be in the hands of people who can really make changes. There are a lot of people investing right now in sustainable tourism. So our goal is to be able to generate all this data and to be able to give it to the people who are taking the big decisions on where to invest on sustainable tourism or any other activity regarding these rural villages. So so yes, big data is one of the most important parts of taking these decisions. As an entrepreneur, data is like the gold for us for taking decisions. So we should make this not only for businesses and for small entrepreneurs, but for the people taking large decisions on where to invest.
I think that's such a good point in terms of data availability and data accessibility. It occurs to me that as more people in the world have access to a mobile phone than have access to a modern toilet, that both tells us something around how we prioritize communication over sanitation, but also what people themselves value in their lives, that actually access to that information, access to communication is so highly valued, and that gives us the opportunity to provide information to people and to give the same kind of data rights as perhaps an organization does. So there's something very exciting there about making data available to people in new ways. Now, Hugo, we've had a lot of questions, and actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Hugo a very specific question, but I'm going to ask my other panelists to reflect on one whilst I ask Hugo a different one. Because we've had a really good question that's come in about intersectionality. We've talked a lot about environmental issues here. We've talked some around poverty and around the intersection between climate and poverty, etc. But I feel like we're standing at a moment when the two biggest conversations in the world are about climate and about equity. How does a sustainable lifestyle relate to gender, to race, to exclusion, to LGBTQIA? How can we bring that conversation and the sustainable lifestyles conversation together? Because in my experience, personally, having spent decades working on this, it does not intersect anywhere near enough as it should, that we talk about sustainable lifestyles and justice in two different breaths. So I'm going to come to all of you, Louise and Louise and Sebastián, to say a word about this. But Hugo, I actually have a slightly different question for you, but please feel free to reflect on the other as well. So we've had a lot of change that's happened over the last couple of years, and new issues and new questions are coming up all the time. Wildcards, climate activists, the new cultural influences that are happening, new technology platforms, TikTok and others that pop up. I noticed we've got Jonathan Weiss on the line. We're having this big conversation that's emerged in the last few months about regulating advertising as part of a sustainable lifestyle. How does a policymaker such as yourself, with the tools that you have access to, how do you engage with these new stakeholders, with the young climate campaigners, with the new activists, with the new technology change makers? How do you even try to keep across that so that policymaking is reflective of this edge of change? Or is that not how policy should work?
Thank you for that easy question. And I think the other one is even easier to answer. I'm sure my co-panelist will have the brilliant thoughts on this one. But I think that policy making doesn't happen in a vacuum. When you look towards policy and legislation, it usually builds up on first a kind of research and scientific consensus on a challenge to be addressed, which is then merged with a societal consensus. And I think that's where the civil society activists come in. And I think they play very different roles. I mean, when you talk about climate activists, I'm fully conscious of the fact that we are separated from them by the fact that their aspirations have no limits, whereas as a public policy body, we have to look for what is politically feasible. And I think that's where the two come together and where you go back to societal consensus. Because living and working in a democratic society, it's the majority that decides. The society as a whole may have aspirations, but you have to convince the majority of the population to support a solution which might or might not impact on what is perceived as quality of life and limits to your aspirations in terms of prosperity. And I think that is clearly where we have found interesting avenues for working with influencers and bloggers. And I am reminded of a conversation with the luxury industry at a point where we were discussing with them and said, well, we're making great efforts at making our operations sustainable, but there are many markets where we are hiding that because their luxury is the equivalent of wasteful. So if you're rich, you can afford to be wasteful. So you're going for a product that is wasteful. Whereas in Europe, a mature market, the approach is how can you make sustainability cool? And I think that's the way to work with influencers and bloggers in that regard, to change the perception, because this is all about perception. So I think I'm putting it one on the political side, the other on the perception side, on the image side, which is really important. But for that, we obviously have to live up to high standards, and those people need to trust that what we're trying to do is actually the right thing. It may not be enough for them, and most of the time it will not be enough for them, but at least to say, well, this is something that we can at least support some of the way. So I think links to civil society are crucial, and working with these big movements is crucial, but also I think conscious of the fact that they have it in their genes that they want to push it further, and that's fine. But the democratic and representative society and politics will actually allow us to go that far. But I think it's fundamentally an issue related to democracy and public participation. And that, in a way, gives me the opportunity to make a small comment on the specific question that you asked in the beginning to all the panelists. We have to be careful to see where the different agendas connect. And I think that very often the argument against sustainability is, oh, well, then you make all the products more expensive and poor people will not be able to do this or that. And I think the interesting thing that we've done is to try to bring the consumer agenda and the sustainability agenda together, saying a sustainable product is also a product of better quality, so it actually gives you more for the money. So just as an example. Now, secondly, when you look at the respect for different religious and sexual orientations, it's all in the context of mindfulness. And if you actually look at the product with a lens that goes beyond the price, you actually take in other considerations on the product quality that actually may be related to the way it's produced, what are the social and environmental impacts in its production and in its consumption. And that brings in ethical and equity considerations, and that's where the agendas can join. I would not entirely agree that the agendas are so disconnected as you have said. I think the agendas are actually quite connected to a large degree, more than we think. The main issue is that it's much easier to measure and quantify environmental impacts than social impacts. And that's where the difference lies. We are, when you look at verification and monitoring, we are way ahead of the social area in the environmental area. And it is still difficult, but we don't have the metrics. And when you look at things like life cycle assessment, the environmental life cycle is very far advanced. Social LCA is still in infancy. It's so difficult to do it because it's so difficult to measure. So an attempt to address your very complex question. Thank you.
A very complex question, but thank you. And thank you for bringing the issue around measurement within that, which I think is key. So Louise, is a sustainable lifestyle intersectional? Do these things cross over, and how?
Very much. I would actually say it's the meeting point of lots of this agenda. It is, in fact, the buy-in for citizens to participate in these larger frameworks of biodiversity, climate change, waste flows, and so on. One of the reasons why we did the 1.5 degree lifestyles was to come up with a very scientific grounding for how changes in lifestyles can contribute to climate change mitigation. But it's also the reason why SEED, for example, is doing lots of training on finance for SDGs and also for climate and biodiversity. Now, it's a very good time to talk about connecting agendas because we have Stockholm plus 50 coming up. And Stockholm, we know that 1972 was when we first had our conference, the UN conference on the human environment. Before then, we had somehow treated this separately and we looked at our problems from separate lenses. And it was until then that we started connecting this agenda. So it's a very good point to reflect on this. And what we're also noticing is that, and I say this so we should be we don't have enough time to be patient. I was going to say be patient with ourselves. We don't have that much time to be patient, but we should also reflect on the difficulty of what we're asking for here. Governance in a form is changing. We have deliberative governance processes. We have citizen panels right now. We have in some countries ombudsman for future generations. And we have lots of new institutional forms for input into governance. We do not yet clearly have mechanisms for governments to immediately respond to just fast-moving changes. This is where you see areas like sexual orientation being left behind because they're too hot to touch. Excuse the word hot there. And you see lots of other topics not being touched, not because there's a lack of interest in them, but because traditional governance models are not really designed to take in this kind of aspects. And in fact, democratic processes almost make it difficult to intervene in consumer choices, right? Because it is in some cases considered as anti-democratic. That I would argue is a bad framing, but that's a whole different thing. The idea of intersection here is that we're beginning to see the climate agenda linked to the lifestyles agenda because we have people, for example, that didn't think it is unfair that they're bearing the brunt of climate change when they did not even contribute to this problem. It sounds almost perverse that we're talking about India, China, Brazil needing to consider reductions at this stage when there's still billions of people that need to meet their basic needs, when in a sense, they did not contribute to the nature of the problem as it is now. It is not to suggest that anyone is completely innocent here, but it is to touch on the complexity of the issue and the need to very deliberately go outside of the norms that we currently know to find solutions. And it is also the reason why rule breakers, social entrepreneurs, and new forms of engagement are especially useful at this point as we're discussing transitions.
Thank you, Louise. And that, Louise, what builds do you have? We have this great new language of intersectional sustainability, of climate justice and environmental justice emerging. How do you approach this in your work?
I'm really glad you asked that question, and it's such a deep kind of topic to explore. I wish we had so much more time to talk about it, but Hugo and Louise actually really went into that topic really well. Hugo, especially with what you said about well these agendas tie into each other, and the difficulty it is in measuring these interconnections, which is quite the difficulty we've had as well in my end in the Philippines. To tell you some examples and stories, especially with the Cacao Project, one of them is, for example, our indirect impact in peace and justice in our town. After our typhoons, we see an upsurge in overexploitation of forest resources. We see poverty where people are desperate enough to commit crimes, for example, cattle rustling and theft. And all of these things emerge because of problematic environmental consequences of climate change. And with the Cacao Project, when we were addressing basic needs such as food security, such as securing livelihoods and making sure that people had food to put on the table for dinner, we started seeing the interconnections between justice and agriculture and environment, which people don't often see. It's not a straightforward link. It's always kind of indirect. And these things, as you mentioned as well, Solly, that people don't talk about sustainability and justice in the same breath. And yet these things are so interconnected, especially with genders and how people have access to food. Sometimes people live in food deserts because they're kind of put away from a lot of the different parts of society. And it's this kind of inclusivity that we lose, and people aren't able to immediately put that direct tie together because, number one, lack of data, lack of social assessment, or lack of these measurements, which is why the work that people like Sebastián are doing are massively important, why we need to encourage more young people to actually bring that in and have solutions-based things and kind of have these eccentric solutions to all these problems that we see, because we're in a changing world. We need modern and odd solutions to address these gaps that we see. And not just that, but also, since we're talking about UNEP, the UN environment, we recently held a policy guidance on children's rights to a healthy environment, how young people lose their rights to a good future, how future generations lose their rights because of how we are currently affecting forests and cities and all of these things going on. They are so interconnected, and we just need to slowly, number one is bring up representation from those areas and see what people are doing. For example, women in agriculture or the LGBTQ community or anyone else, actually. It's just really kind of getting their voices to speak up in it, because they always have a say, but we don't hear enough of their voices on tables like these, on policies like these, and platforms like these, which is why this webinar is so valuable, because we have all of these odd solutions and eccentric change makers coming together to talk about that and debate that, and we're asking these uncomfortable questions. So really, it's really bringing it up and highlighting all of these gaps that we still need to address, because these interconnections, they are there. We just never talk about it. And we never talk about it because it's difficult to talk about it. It's uncomfortable. We're suddenly faced with the reality that we're not limited to our houses, the four corners of our homes, that there are people who are suffering all the way across the ocean because of something that we did here today. So it's just really valuable that we actually address these questions, and thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Louise. It is such a crucial question, and we have so little time left, so I'm just going to tell the rest of the panel. Sebastián, I do want to hear a word from you on how design can enable intersectionality, but the very first question we got asked online was from Nina, who said that she's really struggling to make the case for a sustainable lifestyle to her friends and family. So many people in different traditions are heading to holidays right now. So whether you're on Zoom or at home and sitting across from your grumpy uncle or your over-consuming niece, what is your one sentence? What's the one sentence that you say to convince people that a sustainable lifestyle is a better lifestyle for them? Not for the world, not for the future, but for them. So we're going to come to each of you, and we just have time for one sentence pitches. But first of all, Sebastián, it's such an important question, the one about intersectionality. So I want to give you an opportunity, just one thing. How can design help sustainable lifestyles be intersectional?
Yeah, so just in one phrase, I would say, in Mexico, we thought that bringing people out of poverty and taking care of our environments wasn't aligned, but it is actually. And we are seeing this with sustainable travel as just one example. So we can align this. Okay.
That's perfect. I love it. We must. So I'm going to run through. I'm not going to go in the order I've been going so far. That how can we help Nina? What should Nina say to her friends and her family over that holiday dinner around why a sustainable lifestyle is a better lifestyle? Louise, what's your pitch?
I would say sustainable lifestyle is about quality of life over quantity of life. Instead of counting numbers and possessions and notes and coins, it's about counting the moments of joy and sharing in communities and meaningful engagements, as well as being responsible for others, not just yourself.
Beautiful. Thank you, Louise. Love the word joy. That's been such a theme of this. Hugo, what's your pitch to help Nina?
You said one sentence only, right? And Louise had two. Sorry.
Louise always breaks the rules. It's okay.
But I would say, isn't it more fun to know exactly what you want rather than thoughtlessly pick up many things that you might not even need?
Nice. I like that. I really like that. Nicely done. Thank you, Hugo. Sebastián.
I would think what makes us happy is thinking in the community, not in ourselves. So thinking in the community makes us take that kind of decisions to live sustainably.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sebastián. Louise.
Well, I wrote down here. Well, as I said, there's nothing wrong with having healthier food, cleaner beaches, having fresher air, much more lush forests, and to have more meaningful interactions with friends who are doing the same thing.
Lovely. Thank you so very much. Now, I don't have a pitch. What I do know is that when we surveyed people in the UK and the US and beyond, and we asked them, will living a sustainable lifestyle add to your quality of life or take away from it? The vast majority, well over 60% of people said they thought it would add to. So I hope that Nina finds the people that she's speaking to over the holidays are more open to this than perhaps she might expect. Thank you so much to Louise, to Louise, to Sebastián, to Hugo for joining us. Thank you so much for all the amazing questions that have come in and the debate that's been happening in the chat. And I've been reading, there's been great projects that people have been posing. I want to thank our organisers. I want to thank Jessica, who's online making all of this work for us. This has been a fantastic webinar of the ggkp. I think this is our last one before the holidays, and there will be more to come in 2021. So I wanted to thank everybody for participating. I wanted to wish you a wonderful, happy, joyful life. And if there was one thought that I would leave you with, it's some words that perhaps I wasn't expecting: joy, odd, rule breakers, and eccentric, that came up again and again and again. And perhaps when you're living in unusual times, you need unusual people. And I think I've been very, very lucky to have 4 wonderfully unusual people on this call today. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and I thank you and goodbye.